Okay. I do know that today was officially the last seminar, but in a certain way, what we are going to look at somehow brings together what you read and what was discussed during the year. And it's even more than the other subjects we discussed with Johnny. This is even more an open problem than the rest, if you like. Or at least it has open strands or avenues that are very, still very, not open for creativity, let's put it like that, and or they're not solved or closed. And can be taken from a number of angles. Did you try to read or watch the seminar last year about this topic by Daniel that was on the program?
Watched the seminar some time ago.
Yeah.
Not really.
Did you try to read the article on reversion photography that he wrote about this topic? No. Okay, so we'll have to introduce it. There are a few key words that I put here, and it's good to have in mind, or to keep there while we are discussing it, because the problem is precisely that one can answer it from a number of doors simultaneously. So we have gone, with Johnny as well, you have seen determinism. Determinism and indeterminism. Then I would add the problem of chaos. Then irreversibility. What about that? Symmetry. Reversibility, with this representation was the doubt and the issue. That was addressed throughout the year. And then I would add here blank canvas. Or the problem of the artistic frame. And these are not in any order, they're just here for you to see. The problem of undecidability. Actually, it can be spelled with a U or an I, according to Google. As far as I go. Have I left anything else out? No, not for the moment. Last week you looked at Turing machine, kind of machine thing. What did you get out of that? One free association, one word, an image, whatever comes to you first.
What do you mean by think?
Well, it was the undecidability.
Undecidability.
Yeah.
What do you mean by the undecidability?
Well, it's I guess, for Turing, the way you couldn't tell whether you were conversing with a human or a computer was the fact that they could answer questions in almost an unexpected way.
Mm-hmm.
I think you said something about having a roulette wheel or something inside the algorithm that kind of puts in a bit of a spin of it, randomness.
Random, yeah.
Precisely. Now, what we are looking at today links precisely with this problem from just a different area of science to start, as a starting point, but goes then back to this issue of determinism or indeterminism the problem of chaos or chaotic behavior that indeterminism brings into the way of thinking. I believe it is important to as a preliminary entry point on these. These are concepts we are stealing from science, and we are not. I'm not a scientist of any sort. I read philosophy coming from contemporary art. I find that there are very interesting questions from the methodology that science uses that are important for us as artists, and vice versa, that the approach that we bring as artists is very important to challenge some strict application of these methods. So it's very, I say this because I don't want to anybody to fall into the misunderstanding that there is a direct link between quantum physics and making art. There are various ways of splicing and crushing the two things together, letting them resonate, ways that, you know, thinking from one and looking at the other allow to change the way one approaches the problem. Okay. We'll see how to go to this, but don't think that we are explaining art through science or anything like that. That's precisely what we're not doing. Now, the reference we have is an article of Daniel Rubinstein, who has finished his PhD last May in Germany. It is a director of the main photography at Centre St. Martin in London, and has worked on the problem he sees in photography throughout all his career. And he has published now with Johnny this book on the methodology of photography, which you might have seen around. There is an article of his in it, which goes under the ironic title of The Grin of the Schrödinger's Cat. You might be sort of familiar with the paradoxical experiment, mental experiment of Schrödinger and the cat. When at the beginning of the last century, subatomic physics broke out, somehow, I use this expression, exploded as a problem, it upset entirely the understanding we have of matter and the laws of science, the laws of nature, therefore. Because, just to put a very plain summing up, very coarse, particles can be particles or waves of energy at the same time, depending on how one measures them. And depending on how one measures the subatomic particles, one can either get the position or the momentum, or the speed of the particle, but never the two together. Most importantly, there are issues related to the fact that if one shoots one particle only to a wall that has just two slits open, it is impossible to there is a complete indeterminacy or undecidability of where the particle, if the particle is passing by through one cut or the other, until the measurement is made. Which means that the measurement affects the result in a far more radical way than the fact that using a more precise or less precise measuring instrument will do. And then another element of this which also creates a lot of problems is that two particles can be so far in the universe that they are further away than the speed of light would allow them to communicate. And yet, as soon as one measures one, the twin particle, I don't know why there are twin particles, but apparently there are twin particles in subatomic physics. The twin particle immediately reacts in the same way, but it reacts as if it had the information, but it cannot have the information because light would not have reached it in time, and light is the fastest traveling element we have. So how is it possible that they are undecidable before being measured? They can be A or B, and there's a 50-50 probability. Therefore, if the particle I will measure can be black or white, or spin, as it is called technically, a certain degree or less. And the other one would have to react in a specific way according to the spin, but I will not be, this spin somehow does not exist until I measure it. It's not that I do not know, it does not exist. So the problem is how then the other particle can know if nothing travels faster than the speed of light in the universe is one of the fundamental assumptions of physics now. It remains open as far as the texts we are reading understand. So there are all these problems that below atoms, below the fact that to us matter is hard or solid, if you bang your head against it, it is painful, things become very muddy, very confused. They become undecidable. Even more so, the problem that Daniel addresses in specific in his text, which he takes from Popper. Karl Popper was a philosopher of science that worked in the middle of the 20th century, late 20s, 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. And he was very much concerned of the consequences of scientific methodologies, what they made for our frame of mind, or our way of thinking, and the political implications. We'll get there in a minute to that. So let's go back to our measurement. Popper says if we are going to affect the data of our of the nature we are studying through the measurement, and that data is not clear before we measure it, and there is no reason why we go one way or another, but the measurement makes it go one way or another, then there is an element of randomness that cuts in silently, so to speak, that link that seemed to be the foundation of the possibility of knowing between the subject and the object. Does it make some sense, this problem, at all? No, somebody told me that I go at times I go a bit fast. I don't want to go too fast, and this is the kernel. Determinism, which is the model of thought of classic science from Newton, Descartes and Newton to the beginning of the 20th century, more or less. When the end is fuzzy, it tapers off. Assume that we can know things, and the things are there. It is just a matter of getting the right tool, the right measurement to get to them. And if you have a vague memory of high school science classes, Newton's universe is entirely mechanical, and it's just made up of out of atoms or bodies clashing into each other. And if one could, in principle, know the state of the universe in this specific instant, what is clashing against what, in which direction, in which force, could predict to the end of time how the universe will develop, but could also reconstruct what the universe had done until now. It is literally, the model was the balls on a pool table, thinking on how they clash together. If you could have enough room in your brain, enough RAM in your calculating machine to calculate all the movement at once, you could calculate the whole universe. This was the frame, the image that the scientists had of the universe. And they were aware that they weren't there technically, but they thought that was attainable, that was how the universe worked. This problem of undecidability, this randomness that cuts through, says that actually this is not correct. If one wants to be a bit more precise, Newton knew about it already. Newton knew that you could calculate the movement of two bodies, but when you had three bodies, you always had to have approximations. But it was not developed. He left it there, and the idea that you could calculate everything somehow became even bigger than he thought it, and it became, yes, I thought you were raising your hand. Hello. So this randomness that cuts up.
Is that free?
Yeah, that's just my stuff.
Oh, okay. Profit.
The linearity of the possibility of knowing between subject, the scientist, us, and the object, nature, was assumed as the path of certainty, then the support of certainty. These discoveries of quantum physics, so it's just nice representation. The discovery of quantum physics of the undetermined, undecidable behavior of particles upset this model of thought. So, and the model of thought was the determinism, the fact that one could calculate everything from the present. If the present can be considered the cause of the next moment in time, if one knows the state of the present completely, then one can calculate all the following states in a linear way. If I eat this equals that, spit the coffee, this gets wet, Johnny gets upset, or this hits the other thing. But you could actually also spin it backward, so much that the image of the universe was that of a clock. And this metaphor became very, very strong, so much that it's still in language now, that it works like a clock. The precision, the reliability, the predictability were all part of this mechanism. But again, the fact that what has been discovered, the physics discovered that below a certain level of size, literally below atomic level, the behavior of particle is not predictable, and only the measurement will give them a position or a speed or an identity, to use a word a concept we have already looked at. And there is no rule in how that measurement decides if the particle goes here or goes there, implies randomness. Randomness undermines determinism and gives an image of the world, of the laws of nature, as indeterminable, not predictable. It would seem like science is doomed. Well, it cannot know anything and it cannot predict anything. And the two problems start spinning around each other and in a certain way, because obviously one needs some degree of predictability to have a science that is worth pursuing. And at the same time, one needs to keep in mind that that science will never give an absolute measurement. Chaos or chaotic theory, which are things I am a bit more familiar with than problems with quantum physics, are looking at the same issues of randomness and undecidability from the point of view of what is of statistics and behavior of things, rather than calculation of sizes and weights or forces. And it's all about the ratio at which things move, or better, things multiply. One example that I was trying to bring in examples that would be feasible or understandable to make sense, because when you read about this, they are all very much either mathematics or so specifically scientific that they don't make much sense. But for example, one thing that is often looked at is a dripping tap. Apparently a dripping tap, which is closed, so there is no water coming out of it. Then if you open it just a bit, it has a rhythm of one, toop, toop, toop. If you open it just a bit more, you have toop, 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 two at a time. Some taps, depending on the gauge of the pipe, might go four at a time, but if you give it more water to it or more speed to it, it goes into a chaotic flow where there is no more rhythm. It's just the water falls without order. Think of economics, completely different environment. I produce pens. If there is no demand whatsoever for blue pens, my business just dies even before starting. If there is too much demand, I go bust equally because I cannot sustain demand, I cannot sell to all my clients, and they will go somewhere else. I need to strike a balance between the two. And that balance is always a very, very narrow window between wide areas of chaotic, disordered behavior. Evolution, natural evolution, Darwin is calculating along the same lines. Of all the different kind of attempts that nature makes to develop bodies one way or another, one is more successful, therefore has more offsprings, and rather quickly the whole species is realigned to that specific mutation, and all the others have not reproduced. And that is the same chaotic window, or better, window of order within a wider chaotic behavior. So, let's make a diagram about this. Determinism had, if we want to keep our idea, the eye of the subject or scientist, whichever you want to call it, and the object was certain. There was no problem. And everything, the whole universe, could be understood, could be represented in these terms. So you could have endless lines in all directions. What chaotic behaviors that instead are ruled by undecidability present is that there might be an eye that look, but the window of order of the object is very narrow. All this is all disordered, messy, and more so, as I was briefly explaining on the undecidability of quantum physics. Before I did discover what my subatomic particle is here, I don't know. I arrive here and there is somehow a bifurcation. It can be white or black. And only the measurement will make it white or black. It's a paradox for our logic. Our logic still reasons with these terms. But precisely because is the measurement, whatever I'm using, that makes it white or black, and the other one disappears, becomes an option, that a possibility that hasn't happened. There is this space in between, very much like the abyss that Heidegger speaks about. Very much like the uncanniness of the machine, that we know it's a machine but behaves or can be taken as a human. This is the randomness that that the article seizes upon following Popper analysis of. Popper comes up with a very interesting metaphor for this problem. He said the book is titled, I got it in Italian, but it's Cloud and Clocks. And the subtitle is Of Determinism, Freedom and Rationality. The problem he sees in these is that if we have this model where everything is deterministic, then let's imagine that, expand it to its extreme possibilities. Then also our decisions, our choices, are ruled by a chain of cause and effect. Do you see these? Does it make sense? Physical cause and effects, the same that rule the spinning of the planets, the boiling of water over fire, are controlling us. Therefore, what happens to our freedom? to our creativity as artists, to our political position, freedom in society? Are we completely ruled? Are we parts, cogs in an immense machine, can be wound backward or spun forward? We've got no possibility of deciding. And he doesn't like this model at all. So he's attracted very much by the indeterminism model. But at the same time, he says, well, but if the bottom line is that there is randomness before we reach our object of knowledge, then everything is random, because we arrive to a certain level and we can be somehow certain of what we are knowing, and then beyond that we are uncertain. Randomness decides for us what we're going to know. So then everything is random. But then being subject to a chain of random turns, or we're subject to chance only, for Popper is equally uninteresting or actually negative, because again takes away our possibility of choice, takes away our creativity to turn it into artistic terms. Do you see why both elements are, either everything is completely closed or everything is completely open? There is no position for a subject, for a creative mind, for a mind that finds its ways through things and works with one side or another. And it's quite interesting that these two models, the determinism and the indeterminism, obviously that they don't happen in isolation in society and in history. The Newtonian mechanic model of the universe, Newton published the Principia Mathematica in 1668, something like that, in the end of the 17th century. That's is when the Enlightenment picks up, starts off, and at the same time, new theories of society comes up that are very, very different than the straightforward monarchies of the Middle Ages and of the lords of the Renaissance. The idea of a rational individual that can decide and take responsibility for its action, for his or her action in society, is contemporary to this. There is a whole move, or all that sort of direction of culture that involves both science and politics, that looks at or is based upon the idea that everything is rational, understandable, comprehensible, and therefore permits deciding. The problems that happens with quantum physics and the problems that happens with quantum physics are physical scientific discoveries, but the resonance that randomness has, it's contemporary to all the disorder and dramas of 2 world wars in Europe, fascism, Nazism. For Popper also, Stalinism, he was very much keeping them at the same distance from his view of Stalinism obviously was negative, but also all the leftist position, the socialist for him was equally negative, was because it was curtailing individual freedom. They all happen, there is a randomness. If there is no certainty, then we are precipitating an abyss. That's the fear that this problem brings up. This impossibility of being certain of the thing in itself. So this somehow seems, it is a change of paradigm. Certainty and determinism is a scientific paradigm that is not only scientific, as I was saying, but it goes out into politics, understanding of society, understanding of the individual. And then this paradigm is broken for a new paradigm of indeterminacy, but the paradigm of indeterminacy is far more difficult to navigate, because every step is almost like walking on have. There was, regarding this, it was last night on Channel 4, brought up the work of an economist called Minsk, who was writing in the 70s and had been completely ignored, and he had figured out exactly how the economic crisis in 2008 happened. In the most simple possible way. You remember the crisis of 1929 and the depression that followed in the 30s, and he said, well, there are three stages in economics. The stage that follows a crisis, everybody remembers very well, everybody's extremely cautious, and if they give a mortgage, they give a mortgage to somebody who is certainly going to pay it back. And there's a second stage where things go rather well, and therefore things are relaxed. You try to give mortgages to people that are quite likely to pay it back, maybe a small percentage of them won't pay it back. And then there is the last stage where almost nobody remembers a crisis, or nobody remembers it at all, and it's the age of the Ponzi scheme, where you give 99% mortgages to people that are very likely not to be able to repay it, hoping that you will just playing this game of cards. And he's saying, so mentioning this? Yes, that the certainty of the continuous circulation was a projected image that is actually building the roots of the disorder within itself. And it is precisely the randomness that we find here. So this problem can be taken from various angles. Randomness or chaotic behavior is always around the corner. Mandelbrot fractals deal with this issue of there was Uber reading Nina Samuel. The fractal problems deal with the same, because you can have you're familiar with what a fractal is. Fractal is a pattern that repeats itself, and is called self-similar. It means that no matter how much you zoom in or zoom out, you see the same pattern. There are a number of different models available of this self-similarity in fractals. But what is very interesting is that if you are, for example, looking, started thinking of this link between the subject, scientist, and its subject of study, if you are looking for a moment where you finally know everything about it, or you finally reached the smallest possible particle, well, if the closer you get, the more you get the same pattern but smaller, you never get to it. You always get to some sort of it-ish. It's an infinitesimal approach to it. And there are one of the one can see it on YouTube. It's called Julia set with J. Is the one with the fractal set that Mandelbrot defined mathematically as the most famous thing he discovered. And you can you type in Julia set and you look for on other videos, and there's a 15-minute zooming in into the Julia set, and you feel you're starting from a detail and you're going into galaxies of galaxies of galaxies of galaxies of galaxies of the same curve repeating itself, repeating itself, repeating itself, repeating itself. And you never reach the end of it. So I'm not saying that our body functions like that, but if you think of defining an identity, can easily say, well, Mattia is Italian, easy. But then is Italian, not Italian from Milan, not from Naples, so it is different. Then it's 20 years it is left Italy. So again, there's another curve attached to it. We never really liked when it was going up and starting there what is so. So how Italian am I? You see, you have all these cutting off the corner, but you never reach a complete circle of my life. Certainly I am a big British after 30 years here, plus 7 in the United States, something else attached to it. There is a similar way of looking at the definition of an identity, similar is. If we want to jump back to Heidegger, which I know you won't like, small bb, which could be me, for example, and big B being, which is pure, infinite, without definition existence. Literally the infinitive of the verb to be. I, or any of us, would be an infinitesimal instance of this. And when you look inside me for this, you will never find it, because you always there will always be more specification of who I am. Down to, you can count how many I missed or how many I still have. And you never get to strip me off all the definition to get to an essence. You never get to the thing itself. This is a problem that Kant already had described at the end of the 18th century in the Critique of Pure Reason, where he said that we do not know the thing itself because we always organize it through our ways of knowing it, through an intuition of space-time. An object is always in space and in time. We all agree about that, but he says space and time are forms of our intuition. They're not outside their abstract form. And then that intuition is organized by category of the intellect, regulated by ideas of reason. You never get to it. It's called sort of correlation. It was not falling down into randomness because he held some object of knowledge, but it was not the pure object. It was the object already organized for us. Imagine about this. This is always, I like to contemplate the idea. We can see things, but if we be total darkness and would only touch them, we'll probably know everything that is around here, including us, in very, very different terms. And yet we would get to know what is here. So just by making a difference between the senses, one will have the problem of never reaching the it and yet having an element of knowledge. And for Kant, that worked in a certain way. But once one reaches the randomness of raised by quantum physics, by chaotic behaviors, that is a far more radical interruption in this direct link. Have I lost you entirely?
No,
No.
like would you say the randomness is like a rupture, like guitar, to lose guitar or so like,
You were asking something else just when
Mine was different.
was completely different. Define more what the Guattari say about rupture here, because it is and it isn't in a certain way to me.
well, they just talk about a rupture, sort of interrupting the lines of flight, I think.
Yes, no, it is not exactly that. What this brings up, remember your question. What this brings up is that instead of having a perfect pattern that goes to infinity in each direction, actually we can pretend that this is 3D space stage. If it makes sense to you. Can you all see it? And you have the bottom one. So you have height, depth, and depth and width here. Instead of having these going to infinity, certain and measurable, separated, literally a stage, we have something that is denser in the center and then more rarefied, less dense, less intense, more spread out. And a line of light is precisely, it's a vector that goes, and actually these should all be considered vectors. and they are in the interruption is where they are sort of stopped in the abstract, in the not defined form, and they take some form in time and space. That's the rupture, the interruption of the line of flight. Or if you like, the line of flight happens in this undecidable area of randomness, where, between quotation, everything is possible. It's not the right expression, but just to create a contrast. And then if you want to add something out of that everything, then interrupt the line of flight, and it just collapses onto the, so much that actually the measurement that gives the particle a position is called the collapsing of the wave function of the possibility of its position. It is called phase space in statistical mechanics. A space that is not this form of space, but is undulated and has areas where things fall more easily. And is the metaphor of space is because obviously if something is lower, gravity attracts whatever body pulls into it, and others where inside things are unstable and so fall down. And and the particle is supposed to be anywhere on that phase space, and when you measure it, you make that phase space collapse and it goes into normal space. But that becomes so complicated. So it is not that kind of rupture. If in a certain way it is, it's good that you brought it up because it relates to it directly, but the randomness is the pure vector, and the rupture is what gives it body or identity, specific identity, if you like. Did I answer? Is everybody clear with this? I know it's a very fluid environment to discuss.
You know, the thing, the mental block that you can't ever get to the end point, isn't that going back to the Hegelian that you can't be in the moment, you're always in the nowhere, the immediate?
No. No, because there are two elements to the Hegelian move that are distinct from the fractal. The first one is that, and the most important one, I believe, is that the Hegelian machine, or the Hegelian move, is somehow contained, it's closed. At a certain point, we'll have drawn the final boundary, and that's it. And Hegel goes as far as identifying to identify a moment in history when this happens, and that he identifies in the philosophy of right, one of the last things he wrote, more or less. He identifies the Prussian state when he was living as the realization of the course of history where spirit becomes self-conscious through all the steps of its development. And after that, that's is perfection realized, and after that things will just repeat themselves flat, with no more positions. And the other element, which is reciprocal or symmetrical, is that the Hegel becoming Hegelian change happens through what he calls negation, in a position that is specific, like hands. Like one is the opposite of the other, if you like. If this is all of the universe for Hegel, you can have any cut of this square as you like. You can have it like this. You can have it just a circle out of that. It doesn't matter. You can have just a small bit here, but you always have these. Plus that, this one, these two, and that's all you have. So you already have a whole picture of it. You will reach, that's the teleology that Johnny goes on about all the time. So there isn't really a way out of it. If you are inside it, you remain trapped in it. While the fractal is...
So that's like a zero sum.
Precisely. This is the totality that is closed. Nothing is left out. The fractal instead is the same of the ephemeral skin of your tile, which keeps falling over itself but never closes. So it's very, very different, and the randomness gets in that direction. But there is another way of approaching that problem. The chaotic randomness. I agree there is a jump. I don't. I see it more intuitively myself than I can't explain every step in between linking randomness to that. But it's the same. They're all problems that go towards undermining radically these, because these would be a deterministic rule. We know everything, and if we know everything now, we know where it will go, so therefore we can close the image of it. This model, if we want to look at the Hegelian as deterministic, is the one that had produced the idea of a God, or it was coming out of the idea of a God that was sitting in eternity, where time was an eternal present. Any moment in time was equally present for God in that image. So the Big Bang, which was actually somehow proven last week, I don't know if you saw that, and the entropic death of the universe, where there is just a lukewarm distribution of things with no more differences, would be all there laid out in front of God's gaze. So that God would know the whole of the universe because it would be entirely predictable. That's precisely it. Deterministic. Indeterminism with randomness breaks it down.
That was my question. I wanted to ask, so it's the role of the perceiver that alters or has some kind of effect on the outcome of whether it goes to white or black.
Yes. But he's an active perceiver. It's the role of a measurement. I would add, I don't know if science has addressed this problem, quantum physics or in detail or not, but I would add that, and this is what brings these arguments straight into art, that depending on which instrument you use, you might get a different measurement. I always bang on this drum because I think it is extremely important. We know as artists that not every technology, not every artistic tool produces the same result. We know that the artistic tool or the artistic technique is not a neutral vehicle that carries our intention to a meaning. I think we agree with this. We think that in a couple of, I don't remember if it was last time or the previous one, we were trying to understand, or I was proposing the idea that probably we like more sitting in the studio making things than wanting to realize a meaning we have in mind with the work we do, which would somehow reflect or be parallel to these. I am the subject with an intention, an idea, a meaning in my mind, and I want to realize it. And then the art piece is that meaning externalized and put there, and I control it entirely. These would function in this deterministic color or area, if you like, fashion. While having a love for intriguing objects, or maybe just playing around with papier-mâché, I just find that this is actually absolutely nothing. It is so much absolutely nothing that it actually is interesting. What can I do with that? And I actually like playing with papier-mâché, and I go back to it. And at a certain point, I saw it in my studio one day, and it is such a enigmatic object that deserves to be multiplied and distributed to the art school. That was last year when this was made. I don't know who made it. Then I have accepted a number of random cuts in my intentional process. I didn't know what I was doing with these. I started playing with the papier-mâché. I assumed that this is the process, but this is the way I would go about it. And then maybe I was trying to make a mask and it didn't work, and I just matched it all up and threw it away. And then it dried, and it is something, but it's a thing without a meaning. Well, if it is a thing without a meaning in an art environment, in itself, it has a meaning precisely because it doesn't have a meaning. Why it is there otherwise? Right? So things can become layered up, and then the final solution, which is not a solution, which is not a solution, but a question, is to let's put it out and see what happens, and the reactions that these have got also go over a threshold of randomness. And since we have got to this point of art and this threshold of randomness, in the article of Daniel about the green of the Schrödinger's cat, and the green is towards the certainty of determinism, he wants to link these to photography. And he says something that I think is very, very important. I might read it. He's on page 38, if you ever get to get this book. He has been playing with the mental experiment of the Schrödinger's cat, which is an experiment that Schrödinger, who is a physicist in the first half of the 20th century, proposed to show the absurdity of applying these undecidability to macroscopic level to our lives. But somehow it has been seized by the scientific community, or better by the discourse of the scientific community, as a proof that this is valid everywhere. The very brief description, he imagines a box, completely sealed, with no communication whatsoever with the outside world, in which there is a gun that shoots one particle of light, one photon. It's a subatomic particle. When it goes to the wall with the two slits or the mirror, whatever they use, it will go through one or the other, but you will not be able, that will remain undecided until one measures it. And let's be clear about this. It's not that we will not know which direction it took until we measure it. It will not have a direction, it will not have a position when it is measured. That's what is really freaking out the rationality, our logic. And he's saying, to make the situation even more absurd, let's imagine that inside the box there is a cat. And that if the particle goes through the right slit, that's fine, the particle travels away. If it goes through the left slit, there is a jar of cyanide, the jar is broken, and the cat is killed by the poison gas. But because we haven't yet measured what has happened inside the box, the cat is at the same time dead and alive. A paradoxical situation. There have been endless speculations about this. I am not familiar enough with all the technical approaches to go indefinitely. But what Daniel writes about is before letting go of the cat, let me spell out the significance of the fill-in in photography. To photography. The photographic aspect of this experiment is not only in the exposure of the light-sensitive cell to the particle of light. He imagines that there is a cell that will trigger the breaking of the jar, not just the particle going through. So not just the exposure of the light-sensitive cell to the particle of light, but also, and critically, the requirement for isolation between the room with the cat and the observer outside the room. This rupture, this will answer this problem. Yeah. This rupture exposes the divide between the moment of inscription by light that is taking place within the camera and the moment of developing or processing that is taking place when a measurement is being made. He's somehow thinking of film here, but it's not. It's just easier to realize. Could be the sensor being exposed. In this rupture, the ontological condition of the photographic image is revealed as the difference between two incommensurable states. It's and then it continues in another sentence. The principle of photography is not the indexical connection between past and present, nor it is the representation of abstract forms. but in the visual presentation of time as internally divided. The requirement for rupture institutes the possibility of an image that captures indeterminacy and asymmetry as the very condition of visuality. What I find very, very important here is the fact that the photographic image is revealed as the difference between two incommensurable states. Difference is a key word that has returned throughout the seminars. I'm sure that it's still ringing in your ears with Johnny's voice. It is precisely this problem. If Heidegger saw it as in, and he was drawing from Hegel as well on this problem, well, the fact that my identity is a specific instance, and if I want to strip it to get to my essence, I get to nothing. And nothing is the only thing that is different from everything else. If I want to imagine something that is really different from everything, that cannot be linked to anything whatsoever, it is nothing. But that's precisely, this is where Hegel links nothing to being and being to nothing. But then, because he says if this nothing is what is different from everything else, then it is something that is precisely being. And being is nothing because being is not any of its specific historical, spatial realization. It's only, it is nothing. So far, Heidegger, at the beginning of the first book he wrote, Being and Time, says that in between items, small beings, they're only separated by nothing. And that's precisely what being is. And that's difference is this game. You break away all the specific differences, the trivial differences, you get to something that is completely undetermined, completely undecidable. Is the fog at the edge of all these vectors, and where everything is possible but nothing happens. This is why I brought up the issue of the another keyword here is the blank canvas. The blank canvas as a metaphor can be a blank canvas, it can be us walking into a new studio with nothing in it, or deciding if you start a foundation. One day you try painting, or day you try video camera, or day you something else entirely. You have to start with major exclusions of things in order to narrow down to something that can actually take place. And otherwise you remain in a realm or environment of complete floating randomness and undecidability. What can you do? If, I want to be an artist. A friend of mine goes back and forth with Berlin because he's the guy that runs the system model. And he says, it's amazing. In Berlin, you keep meeting people who say they're artists. And then you ask them what they do. And they don't do anything. If they are lucky, they have a job. Otherwise, lucky with interpretation, otherwise somebody pays for them. But they do nothing. They exist in this limbo just because they're in Berlin, they're supposed to be artists. But they don't get to make, because being artist by itself is a realm of randomness. Nothing really takes place. They have no curiosity in a specific direction. I know I'm not criticizing the person, but they are not focusing on a specific topic. They are not working on specific technology. They are not engaging with whatever. So there is no definition. They live in pure difference, although it's a sort of negative report in these terms. But they have a sort of human blank canvas, they have a problem they are facing. And so where everything is possible, one could become a performer, a painter, a photographer, a digital artist, whatever else you want to think of. But you have to, it's a game between all that is possible and then making one become real. Which is exactly what happens when one measures, when one decides, well, I'm going to measure with measuring tape, with a photographic camera, with sample. I'm going to pick up a tool, and a tool has some dimensions and not others, some possibilities and not others.
Isn't artistic activity then a mix of those two paradigms?
Very good.
So there's always that degree of intention, but however you work through that, there are so many iterations and so many different paths to go on.
Precisely.
Randomness comes into it.
So much that Popper and Daniel picks up on it, introduces the notion of plastic control. Now, to me, it's a delicate concept because it could be seen as a third position of a subject that is no longer the abstract mind with intentionality. Here it is not the object or the technology. Here it is a third external one. But the way it is presented here, and why it is very, very important, I very much appreciate that you brought this up, is that the subject, scientist, thought, mind, and one wants to have, is always with the body. There is no. One of the problems that the determinist paradigm or model of thought had, which came from the Cartesian approach to the problem of engaging with reality, is that you could actually extrapolate thought from the body, and then you have to find a way to keep them together, but they were abstract. While obviously not. No. The thought, whether the mind is in the brain or not, quite likely, but it doesn't happen without the body. At least human thought. Now, the old digital new phenomena might push us to reconsider, not as into think maybe thought is without the body, but to consider what it means to have a body and not. But so this problem of mixing the two and having somehow a messy solution rather than such a clear distinction or a precipitating complete randomness, because this is as doomed as that one. One is completely closed and one is locked, and the one is undetermined, so nothing could take place. Is this idea that the intention shapes itself with the possibilities it finds, or with whatever. To me, this is very interesting because letting go of this model of certainty, postmodern would come up and say, well, actually, we are dwelling on a completely shaky ground. We are just thinking that we are walking on a solid ground, but actually it's just made of particles that shift and move. And actually, if we could vibrate at the right speed, we could move through the floor or through the wall. But this has been the kind of superhero. It's a sort of spooky idea that what seems solid is not. It's just energy. So the notion of abyss somehow enters here. And a number of problems come out of these, because then these could be seen as the other part, the negative part of Hegel, can be seen as luck. So something that we would like so much to recuperate our knowledge that we can't. And I think, and this is what is the direction in which a number of new experiments are going in philosophy, is that it would be very interesting to think of these randomness as another dimension of our way of being. The fact that not everything is decidable, or not everything that has been decided remains decided. But to retain a certain doubt associated with the expression that Johnny always mentions of the dare to know. It's a Kantian idea. But you try to be curious and be curious to the maximum extent, but you also be prepared to doubt your own. Keep open questions rather than be blinded by your own certainty.
I was just wondering how much that was tied to probability, in the sense that random is governed by probability, but not all probabilities are the same. And so you could say that something, a cup on the table could move. There is a probability that that could happen molecularly, so I understand. But the probability is so slight that it wouldn't happen within the lifetime of the solar system or whatever. So for all intents and purposes, that is more of a determinist view, isn't it? It depends how you what the rate of probability is critical here.
Yes, but let's, it's good that you brought this up because I was actually forgetting another important point, asymmetry and irreversibility. Be prepared to repeat what you just said because it will come back. These deterministic model of certainty of modern science, the Newtonian, where we are certain that that there is something there to know, as I was describing earlier, is a mechanical image of the universe, literally like a huge machine full of wheels, cogs, the cog wheels, like a clock. So it is spinning in this direction, but precisely because it can be seen in its entirety from outside, so to speak, then it could also be spun backward. So its movement, time, for Newton time in principle is reversible, is symmetrical. There is a symmetry of causes and effects. These breaks that symmetry. These creates an asymmetry because there isn't yet what we are going to know. And once that happens, once that measurement has been taken, it cannot be taken back.
Does it also collapse the separate identities of subject and object?
Very nice. Say more about this. Yeah, I will say yes, but
Well, if they have some kind of relationship or connection that sets up the dynamic between them in a way, they're not as separate. In a way, they're sort of connected before the event.
almost connected before the event. I would.
Well,
It's the same game that you'd seen in earlier about relation of identity being the relation.
Okay.
So you're right, but they're not connected before the event.
Okay.
Their connection is the event.
Their connection is the event.
I had some notes I was writing here earlier. Is it not sort of the case that the observed is also observing at the same time in a kind of mutual relationship where you get to that point of having to observe that and then having that outcome? It's actually a two-way following back round relationship between subject and object. But like, I was thinking it in the way of when you picked up this thing here and you were like, well, I'm an artist and I want to think about something to do with that, but you have to have, it's not just you having that relationship with this object, but object has to have some form of relationship with the subject to be able to create something.
So I said again, the subject needs to have some relationship with the object in order to create.
But the object needs to have some form of relationship with the subject.
What do you mean by that? How would the object have a relation with the subject?
Within that meeting point that you could put down into this quantum mechanical field, but in everyday sort of object, that object needs to have a relationship with me in some form, and not just a space-time relationship, a kind of connectivity that goes both ways.
Is that the connectivity of supernatural, paranormal connectivity.
Yeah. No, I mean not that, but I mean a lot of quantum mechanics talks about that before we kind of really started to understand it. And it was quite paranormal. I wouldn't say it was paranormal at all. I'd say, but there's a certain form of within observation. There is a two-way thing. We meet at the same point. Maybe the object discovers us, or very much like scientific discovery. Maybe that scientific discovery discovers like the mind, the human mind at the same sort of time. And it's not. I'm not saying it's paranormal or kind of some kind of.
No, I was saying because I was trying to understand what you meant
not
there.
separate.
There is a kind of meeting of my beings. If we go Heideggerian beings, they're not like we won't say we have a mind, but there's two beings in that relationship at that point in time, and they're meeting, and maybe it's not just that, because using just the subject to observe the world, you're getting into this very epistemological, this is the structure of how I see the world, and objects are still second to anything like that. And actually building it more
you're right.
into...
I realised through your comment that what I didn't emphasize enough is that with these distribution of things, this approach, these happens, the separation between, it's the same thing that you actually just mentioned, the separation between subject and object as pre-existing falls down. It's precisely again what Heidegger describes. There exists the relation before, or at least at the same time, as the end points. You would not be able to have the end points before the relation is set. So much that you do not have the particle until you measure it. And that's an event. Now, when you've measured it, that will assume a place in space, a direction and a velocity, and if we have to follow particle physics more in detail, it will also affect some other particle of the other opposite end of the universe in some ways that I don't understand. To link back to your restriction, to your comment about the restriction of possibilities, have you ever seen Bruce Nauman, one of the first videos where he does the packet walk in the empty studio? He's just out of the master. It's you in a few months' time. He rents a studio, it's a big loft, it's really empty, and he's in there. Probably there is a desk, that's about it. And he has a video camera. And he sets the video camera on the tripod and starts walking around the studio with his hands back, holding his legs stiff. So what he's doing is adding limits to what he can do in order to find something that can make sense. And he walks around with his stiff legs, like this. It looks a bit like the Minister of Fun, he walks on the park. He draws it from back, and it doesn't really matter where he takes it from. But he does something as banal as walking about with another limit attached, another reduction. And the more he reduces things, the more he finds something that somehow makes sense. To me, that video is very, very interesting because he defines, by doing that, he defines that art making is a problem of deciding on the tools and the dimension of the tools. Is the way he sees creativity, yes.
I mean, another way of sort of approaching it, for me, perhaps I'm just being too literal, but when we talk about the sort of odd goings on of quantum mechanics and art making, I mean, the quantum mechanics, randomness and strangeness and things being in two places at once and all that, is operating at the sort of particulate level, or quantum level, or where you get particles. But when you put all the particles together into a billiard ball, it's no longer operating, or if it does, it's only once in a lifetime of the solar system. And then we're into Newton, and Newton works unless we approach the speed of light, and then it's relativity. But the point is, they're not all operating at once. The scientists would say they're not all operating at once, unless we take it metaphorically, and we can't mix them together.
Is
that right?
No, I believe it is right. I mean, if my understanding of, I can only read popularized science because I don't understand the mathematics of it. And you're absolutely right. And or better, No, I think it is right, but it's the same doubt I have. You know, but there is another element to attach to this, which somehow makes it doesn't make it anything. Does not make us go to this point where we say, well, why bother about quantum physics? Because anyway, we live in Newtonian world. We never encounter a single photon speaking through our room in the morning, and we can't avoid caring about it. And somehow the notion of plastic control and the reduction possibilities that you brought up goes in the same direction. We stay in this center where things are more dense and make sense, and then they taper off at the end. They become more and more understandable. It doesn't really matter. But there is another with chaos, with the studies of chaos theory. There is another line of scientific research that comes in called complexity theory, which boiled down to one expression says that systems, whatever they are, interact, and in some specific instances, the same specific instances that chaotic behavior make things do something rather than just fall out into disorder. Systems, by repeating what they are doing and nothing else, reach critical thresholds where they create new properties. And those new properties are properties of the system as a whole and not of the individual parts. One of the most first scientific examples of it is the pressure of gas. If one has a full balloon, a balloon full of air, that's gas. It's almost as hard, it's got a pressure, but it's actually only made out of particles moving around in Brownian motion. Now that strength, that force that pushes back when we push the balloon, we telecompress the balloon, is of none of the particle individually. It's of the whole of the particles together. And that can only happen because there is logically, or maybe even even on a scientific natural level, there is some openness so that something else, something new might emerge. This is the subject of my research, and I think that that's precisely why it is relevant to look at these next to contemporary art, next to art making.
Is there a potential risk that if you don't take a balanced view of those two paradigms within art, if you go one particular route, you're putting in place a certain classification or a certain means of value, putting in a value, in a sense, which could lead to an unbalanced conclusion, if you like. I mean, experimentally, that might be of interest. I'm just wondering whether in terms of criticism...
experimentally, especially as an artist, everything is
fine.
And it's good, and it's brilliant. But for what you just said, it's actually exists. There is a French philosopher, rather young, called Untimely. Sorry, my handwriting. Who published a book titled After Finitude, where he actually rejects all the philosophy that comes out of this problem of randomness and says we must be able to hold on to something certain. And he says, because all this is based on relation, or better, what we call a sort of impoverished form of relation, which is correlation. So if nothing happens until I measure it, then nothing happens at all. And what about, he says, what about those ancestral data we have when there were nobody around billions of years ago, and yet we are still measuring them, we're still getting things out of, information out of that. There must be some certainty. But then his conclusion for it, because that is fine as a demand to thought that there must be some certainty, I would welcome it in a certain way. But his consequences is that certainty is can only be reached mathematically. Therefore, only that which can be mathematized is real, the rest doesn't count. We can go for a stroll. So if you take one stand only, probably balanced would be a description that it recalls so much the golden middle of classic times. But there must be a plastic control. Plastic control is an interesting concept. This is why I was asking you to hold on to what you said earlier, because it is plastic. It is controlling it, but it has to adapt itself. And it is actually adapting itself precisely because it is not certain, because it is of the flesh. It's a very interesting proposal that Popper brings up here with this idea of the plastic control. If one doesn't take it too literally as this subject that is able to adapt, but then again, our brain is precise, it is possibility of adapting.
Stem cells.
Stem cells, if one wants to have another. So you see, what is interesting in all this is that if one avoids taking too literally a link between quantum physics, which again we are not studying, but it's the probability throw up. It first goes against the certainty of something to know, in essence, a solid ground, a solid foundation. But actually, it does it physically. It tells us that the ground, the floor we're walking on, is not as solid as we always thought. You may have been there earlier, doubting that we could be certain about the chains of cause and effects as we thought of them 2 centuries earlier. And there is not simply the fact that not that something will be decided when we measure it, but the in-between bit, which is actually not in between, is for the drawing, but it's not in between. It's always a problem of possibility. And this is why I thought you have to keep in mind, be able to repeat that comment he made, because it's everything possible is nothing. All the possible, if you think of my silly example of me, give me all the possible definition of what a human being is, you wouldn't have a person. You have to strip them out and just retain some, have a specific curve through the graph of all possibilities.
So it's like the compossible, isn't it?
Precisely. Yeah, it comes up, Popper comes up with a part of Leibniz as well. And everybody is become, so there is a lot of creativity in these. Because if the plastic control adapts itself, well, in this process of adaptation, it makes choices or assumes directions which are created. It somehow turns inside out the notion that there is science, politics, art, economics, because everything is a creative process of an event of giving presence to things. Yes?
Gillian Rose talks about a plastic boundary.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder if that's that permeable. So she's talking about the same thing as a permeable.
Yes, the permanent boundary rather than a fixed separation. Yes.
Okay.
Which book is that?
Paradiso.
I'm not that familiar with
So I
that.
find it easy to understand it as a boundary, this idea of permeable boundary.
You are
rather
right.
than
I mean,
control.
if we go back to this silly diagram of Hegelian totality, now this jagged line, it would be the boundary between what is and its opposite. Now, your identity and everybody else, now and later. But that's not permeable.
No. But what you were talking
The
about.
fractal curve that goes in and in and in and keeps finding more of the same.
So that's the problem with the zero sum.
Yes.
Mm.
The fractal curve is not permeable as in you can go through it, but goes very close to it because you don't have the two sides somehow. You just have one line folded over itself so many times that creates interiors and exteriors. which are actually fluid, as in how they are relating to each other. But there is an element, I mean, permeability might lead to this idea that there are two sides and you go through it. And it is not specifically that, it's more the fact that on one side it is undecidability, let's leave sides aside.
Yeah.
Undecidability is a cloud which, to keep with Popper's metaphor, progressively can be made into small clocks. You never have an overall clock, you never have the overall totality of a clock. You have,
It has no edges.
it has no edges, precisely. This is why I made this tapering off pointing, because you have something that holds on together here, but it doesn't have edges outside. And it floats in a sea of difference or of randomness, which, according to Popper, is a chance for freedom. There's a chance for creativity. It's a very, very useful thing to draw from. Far more difficult to navigate than this certainty. If I can make a comment, take it with the due grain or probably bag of salt. When I had to do the draft service many years ago in Italy, I could choose between the army or social services. And I chose social services, and I was working in a community for the rehabilitation of drug addicts. And funnily, most of these guys were very right-wing, mostly fascist. And once I made a comment that had there been a fascist regime, they would all have been in jail as junkies, rather than being in a community that would try to rehabilitate them and put them out, put them back on their feet. And the general response was, no. If there had been a fascist regime, we would not have done drugs. In other words, there would have been certainties, rules laid out for us, so clear, so sharp, we would not have had to take any responsibility. This requires us to take responsibility, and it's always an open question. It's very, very difficult, and that's why if one sees the individual as an artist staying here, it's not just, oh, I'm actually painting away and waking up late and getting drunk at night. It's not that. Some artists might do that, but it is a far, far more challenging position to hold. Precisely because it's not entirely a position. It's a dwelling on one leg is always going away one way or another. Even the position becomes plastic. The relation keeps being made. It's a happening event. I might have mentioned him already, but I like his work a lot. Alan Kaproff, the American artist that in the late 50s, early 60s introduced the notion of happening and developed these performances, moments, events as art, made a point in his writings about blurring. All the writings are collected under the title Blurring the Distinction Between Art and Life. And it was blurring the distinction between the notion of performance as in performing on stage, so representing something, or at least doing something in a very specific environment, and performing a task in life. Yeah, the word, the concept, has two different nuances. We can even add now the performing of bonds or stock, whatever entities. How things behave, how do they move, does not mean how they're acting a role on stage, is something else. And he made experiments as in performing the act of shaving, and he was his own actor and spectator in the mirror, but he was also really shaving in the morning. A friend of his who was working along the same line, as a performance, became the mayor of a small town and remained the mayor for some 20 years. Nobody ever knew that that was a performance as much as he was performing the role of the mayor as in being the mayor. So there was this interesting doubleness that comes up. And this doubleness is, for a straight linear logic, would be paradoxical, but yet is precisely one of the kernels of the postmodern move that says, well, one thing is not a closed identity, is always in process of being. of becoming, or it can be seen. It depends on how you take it, but it can be seen as more than one. You never close it. You never get to these with these because there is always cut. There is an open end side an open side that is always it never allows you to fully draw a line around it and have an identity that is fixed.
Yeah, because Deleuze and Guattari talk about the wasp and the orchid and the dependency of that relationship, and they talk about it as a becoming. It's not just the wasp becoming the orchid, but the orchid becoming the wasp. It's kind of like
they speak about that example in the rhizome. Is that in the rhizome introduction? Even more so if I don't know what shape an orchid has. It's a flower. And then there is the wasp here. What they are saying is that these two separate things, which could be seen like the 2 points of before the relation, become a reproductive organ. So
did you say productive?
A reproductive organ. So that, and they are the reproductive organ as long as the wasp or the bee is feeding of the orchid. But then when the wasp moves away, the organ is no longer there. So there is a brief moment of cohesion where out of different things an identity is formed that it holds together for a while and then moves on. You never have, and they're not one the opposite of the other, as in the image of the sexes. This is why they pick it as well, because the flower has got both genders, if I'm not right, I'm not wrong. Plants have both genders. The flower,
with male and female.
yes, and then they use the insects just to spread. Am I right?
The pollen
into the other flower.
Yeah.
So it's an example. So it's not even a metaphor here. It's an example they bring up just to show that the image of opposites that match and close, creating totality, is an image of thought. Is something we are projecting onto reality, but it's not. There is more to it. All things can be seen differently, and if we need to see them differently, then we are breaking up this closed image, complete image, and then there is this draft coming in constantly. It's like having the door open. You'll never be able to warm the room up entirely. So there is an interesting. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Why did you mention these?
Because they talk about it being becoming.
Oh yes, yeah, because it is unsteady. It is a temporary assemblage, and then it can move on. Users. Did I mention all the things I wanted to mention? So, to go back to the list of concepts we started with, the determinism as an image of thought, as an image of the laws of nature, is broken up by an indeterminate element, the randomness bit, or is always is determined but always on the edge of chaos. Order is always on the edge of chaos. There is a small amount of order. The wasp and the orchid, if we want to give this example, but then they break away, and you do not have something happening. You just have disorder. There is no reproduction. In this instance, there is no reproduction. And precisely because these two are not the elements that compose a zero-sum totality, where one is positive and one is negative, or one is male and one is female, to keep this stereotype distribution of identity.
So they're not binaries, basically.
They are not binaries,
Yeah.
but they are also asymmetrical, and whatever happens is irreversible. Because if you think of a chain of causality that is continuous, uninterrupted, the famous pool balls on the table, this hits this one, this hits this one, you can imagine that this goes back. But if in between these strikes I put a flow of randomness, like a very strong wind that interferes with this, then I cannot reconstruct it. Or I would have to reconstruct it and do the third thing, but then the third thing requires another one, then another one, then another one, and it is a regression to infinity, which is the other problem that comes up with these. Once you open up to randomness, you have open systems. You never get to close these, but you arrive to a point, and then there is something interfering, something prevents it from an identity from closing entirely. To me, this is very interesting because if you think in terms of art again, if you could close entirely what an art piece is, you would have an illustration, a drawing that depicts whatever. It's a fixed amount of information, is very, very readable, and it is either a graphic representation of something, at the most it's advertising, but there is only one reading of it. If it is open, get back to anything, or the painting there, which some people hate, some people love, or any other piece, you keep having questions about it, and you can never fully solve it and put it to rest. So there is constantly an open door somewhere that keeps the thing in motion. That's the way in which I see randomness and difference being very relevant for art making as well. Is it rather clear? I hope I haven't thrown too many things out on the table, and then because randomness does not mean total confusion that anything goes in this instance.
Yeah.
I'll give you another example that is more technically or technologically graspable, but is presents this problem. Again, staying with Daniel Rubinstein, who has written about this quite a bit. In another article, he wrote about digital photography and what he calls the crisis of representation. And the point of his article is that when one takes a photograph with a digital camera or digital film, the raw data is translated into the numbers, the string of numbers, in a way that those numbers have got nothing, they don't know that they are representing a photograph. You need an extra element to know that, so an extra packaging. But most importantly, when you unpack them, you could translate those numbers into music, into whatever else you want. It is data that has been coded in such a way that passes through, it becomes, neutral is not the right word, but he uses the word undecidable, because it can be then anything when you take it out at the opposite end. Do you see this? Do you see what this means?
Depending on the medium used for translation, presumably.
Yes, I mean, I'm not familiar with the technology of coding and algorithm, but depending on which algorithm you use, the data that the sensor receives is packaged in a certain way, and then the camera or the software in the computer unpacks it so that what we see on the screen looks like a photograph. But it is not a photograph as we used to know it when it was analog photography, but also one could unpack that data, those strings of zeros and ones, in entirely different ways and get something else. I remember trying, nothing happened unfortunately, trying to play in the stereo set some CD of my master thesis, see if I would play anything. what kind of sound will come out of it. Unfortunately, there is probably an algorithm that says, well, this is not music, so you cannot play it. But the zeros and one are the same zeros and one, just in different order. If it would be possible to take that algorithm that packages away, who knows what might easily sound like.
I can understand how you might get noise out of it, but not music, surely.
Certainly, but then again, this is a very good point. You may get noise out of it, but it's very much because there is another mind frame or another form of framing, to use an allegorical concept, that says us that music is that. There is a lot of segmental music that is actually precisely challenging the distinction and that makes noise. But I was just curious to see if I could get sound out of something that was text. So that threshold is the same undecidability randomness that happens here. And if you like, what I find very interesting in making art is precisely that this undecidability has broken down the image of art. It's no longer, well, I am an artist, what do you paint? You know, the famous comment that we always get when one says as an artist. And in my work, I try to find ways to make things that are not accepted or are not taken generally as artistic material, and see if I can twist them in one way or another so that they act a bit differently and they raise different questions. But that's possible precisely because the identity circle is not closed, the definition is not closed, and there is room to play with. If we go back to the deterministic mechanical approach, where it started from, Descartes and the moderns, they assumed that there would be no void in between and parts of matter, because otherwise how could they be in contact with each other? But if there is no void, how can actually particles move? How can the atom shift right, left, up, or down if there is no void, if they are completely tightly packed? I always, it's an image, we're taking it metaphorically, but I always thought there must be some randomness of openness so that I push these way, things flow a bit like that. Otherwise I'm completely locked in this block of deterministic matter that doesn't go anywhere.
Is there partly a paradox about nothing itself? That nothing is the void, but nothing is also the fullness of possibility?
Yes, very good. Nothing is the fullness of possibilities because it's inhabitable, but at the same time, when you reduce that one way or another, then you have something. Do you follow this distinction? This is, if you like, is the key. This is why this problem is tackled statistically and not ontological. They no longer expect to find something, to look at statistics here. They speak of waves of probabilities that exist and then collapse. And when they collapse, you have one thing. That's what we know. But that's a blank canvas problem, is where you set your where you decide what to do and what not to do, which technology to use and which technology not to use. Do you see why this problem somehow is linked to Heidegger, is linked to the ephemeral skin of Lyotard, and to Nietzsche, continuous change of things? It's just another take into that problem of not thinking in terms of there is this, and then it's opposite, and that's all. It's by not thinking in opposites, it's thinking of precisely what you just said. All the probabilities amount to nothing, so I have some rather than everything. Have you got any other questions on these? Or? I will Johnny told me that I will be seeing you if you want me to in the next few months, both following your text thesis or in the studio. I don't know how many of you are officially following the course, the seminar, but I'll give you my email address. I'm here every Wednesday, but if we organize it, like 2 or 3 times, I can come up for the whole day because I'm in London. Mattia.p at BT Open World, and it's just a funny pun with what we just discussed, .com. If I don't know exactly in which terms this is supposed to happen, but since I've been doing the seminar a couple of times, then it makes sense that I need to follow this. And we can organize it, and if those of you that want to speak with me decide we organize it so I can come up one day and I see you all, then I come up a few weeks later and we do another round. And then